Welcome to my presentation on the life and legacy of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now you may be asking, whose presentation is this? Well, this will be presented by me, Sarah Huang. Now let's begin. So we begin this presentation with the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover versus Smith. So Hoover, who was a Republican, very important by the way, he won by a landslide, and Smith lost because of his Catholicism and opposition to prohibition. I even have this political cartoon titled Cabinet Meeting If I Were President, and Smith is presented as the Pope. He's in the center because he's Catholic. Al Smith was Catholic, which damaged his chances of presidency because of the anti-Catholic sentiment at the time. And so I also have this election of 1928 electoral map. It depicts Hoover's clear victory, as you can see by the large amount of red. He won. It's very clear. So Hoover supported individualism, isolationism, free enterprise, and small government involvement. And the Great Depression occurred after this election, so you will see a shift in priorities and a shift in party. And so here are some campaign posters for the election of 1932. On the left is Herbert Hoover, and on the right is Franklin D. Roosevelt. I didn't know. Now we skip to the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the Democrats finally win a presidential election, and you can tell by the election of 1932 electoral map depicting Roosevelt's clear victory. As you can see by the mass amount of blue, it's very clear that he won. So you may be wondering, how many elections have the Republicans won before the election of 1932? The answer is 3. That's a lot. So the FDR appealed to black people, farmers, and the forgotten man. So basically the people who were poor and not represented. So that's like partly why he won. He also promised the New Deal, which brings more federal government intervention because Hoover wasn't doing enough. And you can see in this picture that there are people lining up for free soup. The economy is pretty bad, and hopefully FDR can turn it around. In the first 100 days, there are numerous reform bills passed by Congress to launch the New Deal. It's very beneficial, especially when many people were alcoholics, suicidal, unemployed, and homeless. It was a pretty bad time. Someone needs to really act quickly, or the nation will fall apart. That brings me to my political cartoon titled That New Deal. Basically, FDR is saying, you wanted action, and he's throwing all these pieces of paper at America. And so it highlights FDR's swift action during the first 100 days, which caught many people off guard. So you may be wondering, how many pieces of legislation did FDR crank out in the first 100 days? The answer is 15. 15 major bills ranging from banking to agriculture to social welfare to industry, etc., etc. So what did FDR accomplish during the first 100 days? Well, he made the National Bank Holiday, the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, the Civil Conservation Corps, Federal Emergency Relief Act, Glass-Steagall Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act, National Industrial Recovery Act, Tennessee Valley Authority Act, and the Homeowners Refinancing Act. Don't worry, I'm going to explain most of these later anyways. So here's a picture of FDR signing the law that would create the Tennessee Valley Authority. He is hard at work. And I have another political cartoon titled, Did You Ever See Such Service? Where FDR is swiftly delivering this food to this man who says, it takes my great breath away. It highlights FDR's swift action during the 100 days, which caught many people off guard, just like the first one. So, when Hoover was president, what were his approaches? Well, we know he supported individualism, free enterprise, isolationism, and a small government involvement. And he was a rugged individualist, meaning he was convinced that industry, frugality, and self-reliance were necessary. If you didn't understand that, I have this small comic that illustrates this clearly. I was never supposed to be a voice actor. So you're saying people who lost their homes or jobs have only themselves to blame? Exactly! They should have made better decisions. So basically, Hoover believed that citizens should not rely on the government for help and instead help themselves. And there are a few examples of his rugged individualist self shown. There's the Agricultural Marketing Act, which he helps farmers help themselves through producers' cooperatives. He lends money to organizations, not the individual people. He also believes in the trickle-down philosophy. He assists railroads, banks, and credit corporations. He hopes that they, in turn, would cure the unemployment, which was heavily criticized for lending money to bankers who started this mess. He vetoed the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was later picked up by FDR, because he opposed government selling electricity in competition with its own citizens in private companies, which violated his belief in free enterprise. And the Construction and Finance Corporation, the government lending bank provide relief by assisting insurance companies, banks, agricultural organizations, railroads, and local governments. But there's no loan for individuals. And so in this political cartoon, we have Hoover, who is feeding unemployment. So he does not reduce unemployment, but rather makes it bigger. So you're wondering, what was the unemployment rate before FDR took office? 24.9% is the answer. That's a fourth of the population. That's pretty bad. And so in this chart, we have the unemployment rate from 1930 to 1945. The unemployment does not decrease until FDR's term. And so now Hoover is at the end of his term. He is handing off all of his problems to Roosevelt, shown in this political cartoon. Hoover failed to solve a lot of economical problems, so maybe a different approach is needed. Transition to Roosevelt's approach. So he believes in more government involvement. So the New Deal and the 100 Days, cranking out new legislation. There's more power to the president because Congress gives him blank check powers. It gives FDR more legislative authority, and he more directly helps people. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, hiring young unemployed men to improve environment, plant trees, fight fires, maintain national parks, etc. There's also the Fair Labor Standards Act, regulating minimum wages and maximum hours for workers involved in interstate commerce. There's the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, raising agricultural prices by paying farmers not to farm. So the people. Social Security Act provided for unemployment and old age insurance, financed by payroll tax on employer and employees. However, it was criticized for making people too reliant on the government. So it's very clear that Roosevelt was helping more people, contrasting Hoover, who helped the organizations and companies. On to our next topic. I'm going to start off with a question. How many banks in total failed in the 1930s? The answer is 9,000. Here is a graph about all the bank failures from 1920 to 1945. A lot of banks failed. And because of the bank failures of the crash in 1929, it leads to this. This is a picture of the bank run, or a bank run. There were multiple bank runs. And so I also have this political cartoon titled A Wise Economist Asks a Question. So there's this squirrel who talks for some reason. He asks, well, why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good? And then this victim of bank failure replied, I did. And so this political cartoon illustrates that the Great Depression sparked many bank failures and millions of people lost their life savings, even if they were responsible. But luckily, have no fear, FDR has the bank holiday, which closes these banks. So from March 6th to March 10th, banking transactions were suspended across the nation. It gave time for construction of the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, which gave the president power to regulate banking transactions and foreign exchange and reopen solvent or financially sound banks. and the bank crisis was over after this holiday. So during the 1930s, what percentage of American households had a radio? The answer is 90%. And you can tell that the popularity of the radio increases over time in this chart. And so all of these people are listening to FDR's fireside chats. It was a pretty big deal. There was no TV. They had the radio. So FDR delivered 30 speeches, the fireside chats, ranging from banking to unemployment to fighting fascism in Europe. It comforted listeners and restored their confidence in the government, and probably humanity too. The first one was during the bank holiday. 35 million people were assured that banks were secure and it was safer to keep money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. Here is FDR delivering one of his fireside chats. What a good-looking guy. And his influence has really, become a big deal. Here's a statue of a citizen listening to a fireside chat at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. The plaque reads, "I never forget that I live in a house owned by all the American people and that I have been given their trust." Let's talk about the first New Deal. So Franklin D. Roosevelt focused on 3 R's: the relief, recovery, and reform. The short-range goals were relief and immediate recovery, and the long-range goals were permanent recovery and reform of current abuses. And he starts off this first New Deal with the first 100 days and cranks out a bunch of legislation. There's the bank holiday, which closes banks temporarily, and which leads to the Emergency Banking Relief Act, giving FDR the power to regulate banking transactions and foreign exchange and reopen stable banks. There's the Civilian Conservation Corps, hired unemployed young men to work on conservation projects. And there's a picture of some men chopping some logs and an advertisement, probably to get them to join, because it's a swell time. There's the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It grants the money to states for direct dole payments or wages on work projects. There's the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It raised agricultural prices by paying farmers not to farm. In this picture, there's a scene in the county agent's office, St. Augustine, Texas, where a farmer is receiving his AAA check. Very nice. He's getting paid not to farm. There's the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, which brought cheap electric power, full employment, low-costing housing, and environmental improvements to Americans in the Tennessee Valley. And here's the construction of the dam. Very cool. There's the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, created Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured individual bank deposits and ended the tradition of unstable banking. And the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and insured individual deposits up to $5,000. There's the National Recovery Administration. It assisted industry, labor, and unemployment through centralized planning mechanisms that monitored workers' earnings and working hours to distribute work and establish codes for fair competition to ensure that similar procedures were followed by all firms in any particular industrial sector. It's pretty long. And then here's the NRA. That's cool posters. Very nice. There's the Public Works Administration, the Industrial Recovery and Unemployment Relief, as well as construction projects like hospitals, schools, dams, and airports. And finally, there's the Securities and Exchange Commission, regulated stock on Wall Street and curbed the out-of-control speculation that had led to the crash in 1929. And then we move on to the second New Deal. It focused more on long-term reform, relied more heavily on the Keynesian style of deficit spending than the first New Deal. We have the Works Progress Administration. It provided jobs for unemployed people on useful projects like buildings or art. As you can see in this picture, this is the WPA Federal Art Project. So it's not just construction of buildings, it's also art. Really nice. There's the Wagner Act, which protected the right of labor to organize in unions and created the National Labor Relations, which monitored unfair practices. You can see in this picture of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. They are striking thanks to the Wagner Act. And you have the Social Security Act, which provided for employment and old age insurance financed by payroll tax. So you may be wondering, or you're probably not at all, but how much has the GDP grew from the first New Deal, 1933 to 1934, to the second New Deal, 1935 to 1936? The answer is from negative 1.3% in 1933 to 12.9% in 1936. We're getting better already. So deficit spending, in case you didn't know, it's government spending in excess of revenue of funds raised by borrowing rather than from taxation. In April 1937, FDR announced a program to stimulate the economy by planned deficit spending, and that is Keynesian use of government spending and fiscal policy to prime the pump of the economy and encourage consumer spending. It's an economic theory based on John Maynard Keynes. Basically, the central bank should adjust interest rates, and the government should use deficit spending and tax policies to increase purchasing power and hence prosperity. In this political cartoon titled Oh Reliable, FDR is pulling out a rabbit titled Spending and saying, "This is one rabbit that never failed me." So FDR resorts to deficit spending to solve the economic crisis. Critics disagree, but oh well. And then in this political cartoon titled Just in Case They Ever Want to Slow Down, where these two men are riding this steamroller titled New Deal Spending going down a cliff, when the guys on the right is yelling, "How are the brakes on this thing?" And then the other guy's like, "What brakes?" So it really emphasizes that the New Deal spending does not stop because of FDR's liking to Keynesian economics and deficit spending. We have another political cartoon, I know, so many, I couldn't find that many other images, titled A Peculiar Echo, where this American taxpayer is yelling, "Save, save, save!" and the administration is yelling, "Spend, spend, spend!" So it illustrates that the government spending increases due to the New Deal programs during the Great Depression. It's probably not a good time to spend a lot of money when the economy is so poor. But oh well. How much debt did FDR accumulate, you might ask? Well, it's $236 billion, a 1,048% increase from the $23 billion debt level by Herbert Hoover. So FDR did experiment a lot. That's why people love him and hate him. We have this chart noting the debt during the Great Depression. It was high for its time, honestly. I mean, not until World War II. And then we finally had the Supreme Court packing. This was FDR's plan to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every member over 70 who does not retire. It's because he's really salty about the court's objections to the New Deal reforms. And it's controversial because it breaks the system of checks and balances. So you might be wondering, why is FDR so salty? It's because the court rejected him 7 times. It's a lot. So basically, here are 4 political cartoons to describe this experience. So we have this cartoon titled Trying to Change the Umpiring, where President Roosevelt yells to the Supreme Court, "Listen, I don't like your decisions from now on. You're going to have to work with someone who can see things my way." And on the floor, there's a lot of bats with a lot of his legislation, like the AAA, that are titled out. They've been rejected. And so this cartoon is basically FDR comes up with the Supreme Court packing plan because the Supreme Court rejects most of his New Deal reforms. He's really upset. And so with the Supreme Court packing plan, in this political cartoon titled "Do We Want a Ventriloquist Act in the Supreme Court?", criticizing FDR's Supreme Court packing plan by depicting President Franklin D. Roosevelt with 6 new judges likely to be his puppets. People were really afraid that he's just going to bring in people with similar minded like him. People did not like that. And so in this political cartoon, this is the people's response to his plan. basically, FDR's plan becomes controversial and heavily criticized for attempting to break the system of checks and balances. FDR just sadly replies, "All I said was give me 6 more justices," and people are just throwing stuff at him. People didn't like it. And there's Step by Step, which is a warning about the dangers of the Supreme Court packing plan by depicting FDR stepping closer and closer to having absolute power. So in this political cartoon, FDR is walking up. He's already done government reorganization, and if he does Supreme Court revision, he is a step closer to dictatorship. And that marks the end of the life and legacy of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Narrated and everything by Sarah Huang. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my narration and my illustrations. I also hope that you learned something new. I definitely did. I spent many hours researching, illustrating, dubbing, and editing this video. I even stayed up till 10 a.m. to 4 a.m. on Saturday. So I spent a lot of time on this, and hopefully you appreciate it. I'm really sad. And so, yeah, thank you for watching. Once again, you could have been doing other productive stuff, but you're watching this instead. I hope. Yeah. Have a good day.